A new report from TRM Labs reveals that crypto hacks are down significantly at the start of 2023. Roughly $400 million worth of crypto was stolen in the first quarter. That's down 70% from the same time last year. Joining us now to discuss is TRM Labs Head of Legal and Government Affairs, Ari Redbord. Ari, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks so much for having me. Great to be here.
All right, let's dig into this report. It notes that the average hack size got way smaller than last year. What are some of the key takeaways from this?
Yeah, it's interesting. A couple things. First of all, there's rarely very good news when it comes to crypto hacks. So it's great to be able to put out these types of numbers. But I will also say, this very well could be a temporary reprieve, right? We're still, one or two Ronin size, $600 million dollar attacks away from another record year like 2022. That said, look, I think there are some factors that we could point to. First, we've seen, actual prosecutions in these types of cases, starting with Mango Markets, for example, where you see actual prosecution and arrest. So we're seeing law enforcement build cases and ultimately get their hands on some of these attackers. Another piece to all of this is regulatory and enforcement action. Even this week, we saw OFAC from Treasury, the sanctions regulator, sanction individuals and entities and 4 crypto addresses associated with North Korea's cyber program. So we're seeing law enforcement and we're seeing more and more regulatory action, which could very well be having an impact, as well as a number of other factors.
What are the most vulnerable parts of the industry? Where are we seeing most of these hacks and attacks taking place?
Yeah, look, you had those numbers on 2022, and about 80% of that 3.7 billion came from the DeFi ecosystem. So we're still seeing, exploits on bridges and protocols at really unprecedented speed and scale. And that's for a number of reasons. Look, this is essentially software, and we're seeing sort of some of that code exploited. But we're also seeing, the fact that a lot of these businesses are relatively nascent and don't have cyber controls built in. So we're still seeing that real focus on the DeFi ecosystem. I will say, look, all roads lead to North Korea when it comes to these crypto hacks. Of that 3.7 billion, much of that last year could be attributed directly to North Korea. And really, I think what we're seeing is a combination of regulatory action, sort of the OFAC style designations. We're seeing law enforcement, but we're also seeing crypto businesses build anti-money laundering controls. We're seeing better tracing and tracking of funds, and we're also seeing implementation of standards by exchanges to stop the laundering from happening.
Do these numbers tell you that it's, bright days ahead, or do you expect, the next time we have a bull cycle, when there's more money locked in these ecosystems, when there's more products coming to light, more vulnerabilities, that we're going to see these big numbers we saw last year again?
Yeah, I so want to tell you that it's that we're good to go, sort of in crypto hacks. But I think the reality is that this is likely a temporary reprieve. That said, I do think that the ecosystem is doing 2 critical things. First, we're seeing more and more DeFi services and crypto businesses build out cyber controls, really harden those cyber defenses, right? Because the key is stopping these attacks from happening in the first place. But we're also seeing law enforcement globally use tools like TRM to add friction to the laundering process, and making it harder and harder for cyber criminals to off-ramp funds, right? Because that's the key. If you can stop them at those on and off ramps, those exchanges, then we have a better shot of ultimately, either seizing the funds or at least making it harder and harder for them to launder funds. So I think that the short answer to your question is this is likely a temporary reprieve, but I think we're seeing things done in the ecosystem that is going to help long term.
Yeah, Ari, you bring up so many good points here. I just quickly, rephrasing what Jen said, I have to say, when I first saw this report, there was a part of me that was like, this market is kind of dead, even the hackers don't want to deal with it anymore.
Didn't you want a feel-good story on hacks? Isn't that the first thing?
We really did, but then it was...
But I think there's probably, putting aside the many much more reasonable points that you made. There's probably just a little bit of that, right? I mean, I think, when crypto is hot, when it's booming, when it's a, full-on bull market, it probably attracts hackers more than when like things are quieter, it's less exciting. I imagine there's just a tad of that in there somewhere, even if that's not the full story.
I think absolutely. I mean, absolutely. Look, I mean, it's not as good business today as it was a year ago for North Korea cyber criminals or other hackers.
Yeah, hackers are just like, we'll move on to greener pastures.
The funds that they're stealing just simply aren't worth as much today. You can't buy as many missiles today as you could, a year or so ago. I will say, though, that North Korea is an interesting exception because, look, if they can steal a little, right, if they can get any of this off blockchains into fiat to use for, weapons proliferation or other destabilizing activity, it's more than they had before. And they've really already sort of built the infrastructure, that's those cyber teams, Lazarus Group and others, to really sort of have that expertise in doing this. So they're not going to stop. But yeah, no, I think your point is absolutely well taken. It's not as great a business as it was a year or so ago.
Yeah, so it's a little bit of a bearish side here, if hackers are kind of pivoting to other things. But let's just pivot for a second also just to regulation, because I know that's another area of expertise for you. And I just want to talk a little bit about what's going on in Washington. We just talked about this with our previous guest. I was just there recently. The vibe I got was paralysis, like nothing is happening at all. There were a bunch of bills floating around. I don't get the sense that anything is really moving through for various reasons. But it just doesn't seem like there's a lot of momentum to do anything on crypto in Washington in the short term. And I'm just curious if you also have that impression, and if not, what might actually go through.
It's hard. I heard the last segment, and I thought Austin did a great job of sort of walking through sort of some of the legislative paralysis. And a lot of it is macro level politics, right? Nothing can get through, or sort of, there are priorities that just aren't crypto today, in the House and the Senate. So I think that's why we're seeing sort of a lot of issues there. But look, we continue, and there were a number of other questions around sort of securities and commodities and who's going to regulate. And I think part of the issue we're having in the U.S. today, in terms of moving forward, is we're still in the question of who's going to regulate as opposed to how we're going to regulate. And if you look around the world, if you look at MiCA in Europe, if you look at these consultations that are coming out of the UK, if you look at what VARA, the Virtual Asset Regulatory Authority, is doing in Dubai, and the token mapping in Australia, and I can go on, right? They've moved on to how to regulate. And sort of what does legal clarity and legislative clarity look like? And we're still sort of continue to be bogged down on this question of who, CFTC, SEC, or someone else. And I think a combination of political and sort of legislative paralysis, plus not being able to get over this fundamental question here, has really stymied, I think, efforts to have any kind of MiCA-style comprehensive legislation for crypto.
Totally. And it also seems like, just on top of that, is that there's just this is just my opinion, and I'm just curious if you agree, like there just doesn't seem to be that much of an incentive for lawmakers to defend crypto at this point, right? I mean, there's a handful of them that are clearly doing it, but it seems like the negative case, it appears to be stronger, right? So I just don't see a lot of people going to bat for this in the short term, given how many people were burned by FTX, given how many other things are going on in Washington. So like, do you just see anything happening at all before the presidential election? It's just hard for me to see where we would get like the momentum, B, the will, and then just like see the consensus on pushing something through.
Yeah, like you, I was very hopeful on stablecoins. I thought it was the one area where you saw general consensus across parties, and also between industry and policymakers. It looks like that has slowed down a little, but I think if there's anything happening right now in the space, in terms of getting something passed, it's sort of stablecoins where I remain most hopeful rather. But I think the short answer is no. I think it's going to be very, very difficult. And in terms of incentives, look, I think that the industry needs to continue to put together use cases and really come with, hey, this is the key value of this technology, right? This ability to transfer funds cross-border at the speed of the internet, and need to show like the critical use cases that blockchain technology enables from a financial services perspective. Why is DeFi important, and who is it impacting, right? I think that's really, really critical. And where sort of our role comes in, at TRM, is we also want to be able to say, hey, look, the dangers that you're concerned about, money laundering and national security, there are ways to mitigate those risks as well. And we have to do a great job of articulating those things. Otherwise, we're going to continue mired in exactly what you're describing.
Exactly. I totally agree. Yep.
Ari, thank you so much for joining us this morning.
Thanks so much for having me always. Yep.
That was TRM Labs head of legal and government affairs, Ari Redbord.